That night, the rain seemed to want to wash everything away, less what they did to me. I am Indri Click. The handcuffs on my wrist were my new alarm clock. The detective glared at me and called me the Iron Lady of the East, the cruel assassin of the Petrov family. Me, the girl who never managed to hurt a fly. In that instant, right there, I understood the plan. Someone every powerful and clean. I wanted to look exactly like that, guilty. They didn't know, or refused to accept, that the monster behind those crimes wasn't there, in the dark. Men like him watch from afar, clean, untouched, while we paid the price for them. The man who planned, the false evidence, which threw me into this history, it was the spiritual leader, whom everyone loved. A name the whole city protected. At the moment the cell doors closed for me, he would go up to the altar to preach about peace. The newspapers painted me as a mafia criminal, and people believed it easily. And I understood why. When a man who seems to be of God points the finger, nobody asks questions. His lie was the perfect armor. He used the community's faith as a shield, while I was being given as a gift to them. Silent criminals. Being arrested by the mafia was already a life-threatening risk. But being arrested by it meant fighting against the church, the police, and crime all at the same time. What you're going to see today isn't just how I ended up in prison. It's why a man so loved and above suspicion, I needed complete destruction. There is Additail's Mall, but essential, which the leader and his people didn't tell anyone. And that detail, the truth, which I have guarded with my life, is about to be revealed. Liquid. This proves that his betrayal wasn't just a crime. It was the biggest lie the city has ever swallowed. Stay with me. I'll take you inside the cell and relive every moment of the struggle. If you've ever suspected someone who seemed perfect or felt the truth was being hidden, this is your chance. Because I not only survived prison, I gathered the evidence. And now, I'll tell it like an innocent girl. Exposed the mafia boss who preached about God. Before they called me the Iron Lady of the East, my name didn't appear in any newspapers. My life could be summed up in a few lines. An ordinary girl from a forgotten neighborhood in the city, trying to survive with jobs that almost never paid on time. I grew up hearing my mother say that the only thing no one could take away from us was our sense of right and wrong. She said this while counting coins to pay the electricity bill. My father disappeared from the picture early on. He didn't die. He wasn't arrested. He was just absent. One day he left with a small suitcase and a "I'll be right back" that never came back with me. I learned too early that some promises are born dead. Perhaps that's why I cling so much to the idea of justice. It was a way of believing that even when people left, something greater would bring everything back into balance someday. I was never the type of person who drew attention to myself. In school, I was the one who sat in the back, the one who finished other people's work in exchange for silence. I didn't fight. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make enemies. The biggest crime I committed was cheating on a math test to avoid repeating the year. And even then, I spent sleepless nights filled with guilt. My relationship with the Petrov family began by chance, or at least it seemed like chance at the time. I worked as a server in a coffee shop near the center, a place that served more cigarettes and suspicious glances than real coffee. They always came in as a group, expensive clothes, expensive smells, whispered conversations. Everyone there knew who they were, but no one said their name out loud. They were them, and that was enough. One day, one of the women in the group, Elena Petrov, forgot a wallet on the counter. I could have pretended not to see it. I could have opened it, taken out the money, and disappeared with it. Instead, I ran down the street to return it. When I caught up with her, she looked at me as if she wasn't used to that kind of gesture. She took the wallet, stared at me for a few seconds, and said my name. The next day, I went back alone. She said honest people were rare, that people like that deserved better opportunities than cleaning greasy tables late into the night. She asked if I knew how to use a computer, if I liked organizing things, if I was discreet. I answered yes to everything. Not out of ambition, but out of exhaustion. I just wanted to get out of the homework bed routine and breathe a little. That's how I started working for the family, as they called it. At first, everything seemed clean. I organized schedules, confirmed meetings, took notes on calls in an office that was too nice for someone like me. Documents came and went, people too. Sometimes I didn't see them twice. Other times it was like living there, always in a suit, always in a hurry. It was a world far removed from my reality, but one that, suddenly, I needed. I knew they weren't saints. No one with blind cars, armed bodyguards, and conversations cut short is completely innocent. But for a while, I convinced myself that my work was neutral. I didn't pull triggers, I didn't launder money, I didn't make contracts. I just took notes, served customers, made coffee. The line between being an accomplice and being blind is much thinner than it seems, and I walked on it for a long time, pretending not to see the abyss below. It was during those afternoons, organizing papers in a quiet room, that I first heard his name, not as pastor, not as spiritual leader, but as guarantee. One of the men commented, laughing, that with him around, nobody necessarily worries about the police or negative headlines. If things go wrong, he speaks to heaven and the city at the same time, someone said. Everyone laughed. I didn't. At that moment, I had no idea who the person behind that respectable nickname was. Only years later did I understand that name, repeated in hushed tones by criminals and loudly from the pulpit. It was the perfect bridge between the dirty world and the world that pretended to be clean. My connection with his church began in a different way. My mother fell ill. The medicines were expensive, and the doctors were always too busy to explain anything. A neighbor insisted that I take her to the TV church, the one that showed services on Sundays, with cameras, lighting, and promises. She said that the pastor prayed for the sick, and that miracles happened there. I didn't believe in miracles, but I believed in desperation, and ours had already gone beyond all limits. Entering that church was like stepping through a portal to a world I'd only ever seen on screen. Everything shone. The lights, the smiles, the clothes, the words. Not the center, but him, the same man whose name I'd heard whispered in the Petrov's office. The guarantor, the one who conversed with heaven and the city. He seemed larger than life, and on that day, he spoke precisely about people unjustly accused, about burdens that weren't ours, but were thrown onto our shoulders. My mother cried throughout the entire service. I did too, but for a different reason. Something inside me screamed that this man wasn't there in my life by chance. It was as if two lines that had always run separate, the Petrov family's and his, suddenly crossed paths right above me. On the way out, one of the assistants turned around and asked our names. He wrote them down on a form, gave too much guidance, promised prayer, visits, and follow-up. He said the pastor had a special fondness for hard-working people. I should have left that day. I should have cut all ties. But when you're afraid of losing the only person you love, any helping hand feels like support, even when, in reality, it's just the beginning of the trap. I didn't know it yet, but at that moment, between the mafia's office and the long corridors of the church, my sentence was already being written, and it wasn't by God. Behind the altar, the lights, and the Sunday hymns, there was a man whose true faith was power. The pastor, known as the spiritual leader, exerted a magnetic pull over everyone. Politicians, businessmen, housewives, lost youths. He was admired for his eloquent sermons, always speaking of redemption, miracles, and hope. But no one, absolutely no one, dared to cross his path outside the church. Those who came close noticed problematic details. The security guards never smiled. The pastor never walked alone, always surrounded by discreet brothers and drivers who never looked anyone in the eye. On the altar, he said he was a servant of truth. In the confessional, his whispered voice promised to resolve anything, as long as you were willing to pay the invisible price. There were rumors, never proven, that rival pastors moved to other cities after confronting him. Friends disappeared, rivals fell from grace, and he remained untouchable. His services were broadcast to thousands, packed auditoriums, spotlights. No one suspected the parallel routine. Before ascending the pulpit, every Sunday the pastor reviewed the local newspaper and the list of dissidents. He made coded connections, recited names backstage, distributed calculated smiles. He was simultaneously the friend of the desperate and the executor of his own orders. Those who were faithful gained public victories. Those who doubted disappeared without alarm. Every week there were secret meetings. Meetings never recorded, never discussed in the church council. Those closest to him knew. That luxurious office, behind the curtain of miracles, was a bunker of strategies. Everything was discussed there. Money, political alliances, police reports, and above all, how to keep their own names out of any investigation. The pastor was methodical. He had a file with information on everyone: detectives, journalists, judges, government officials. He knew who yielded to bribery and who yielded to faith. The city, blinded by devotion, only saw the public miracle. When boats involved in money laundering or mafia-related activities were seized, the pastor would ascend the altar with a trembling voice and a verse on the tip of his tongue. He would ask for collective prayer, weep softly, and say that satanic attacks were common against those who fight for the truth. And everyone believed him, because he was exactly what they wanted to see, a symbol of hope amidst the chaos. No one noticed that the hand that blessed was the same one that wrote dubious checks in the name of a social cause. More than once I saw him on TV, surrounded by cameras and authorities, smiling and announcing new charitable works. At one of these events, I saw Elena Petrov in the background, discreetly greeting one of the church's security guards. At that moment, I understood that the circles of religious power and criminals did not run parallel. They intersected. In his private circle, the pastor wielded influence not only over the justice system, but also over high-ranking criminals. Mafiosos respected him, not for his faith, but for the reach he had over the eyes and ears of the city. He was the one who approved who could fall without raising suspicion. On the day I was arrested, there was no shouting or protest inside the church. There was only silence from those who understood that the sentence had already been written by orders that came from above, from the altar itself. The pastor never left a trace. The messages were deleted. The meetings were never recorded. The orders given through intermediaries. All the anomalies, all the furor in the authorities' investigations, were stifled by someone always influenced by an act of charity. It was impossible to believe, but he was the silent head of that system of lies. When I, imprisoned and discredited, tried to tell my story, not even the police deigned to look at his name. That was how he remained free. This man serves power more than God himself, and the world he built to hide his crimes was blinder than any prison. The day of the crime didn't begin with bloodshed. It began like any other. Weak coffee, traffic jams, and that unsettling feeling that something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. In the Petrov family office, the atmosphere was different. Too many people bustling through the hallways. Phones interrupted when I entered the room. Quick glances exchanged over my head. I'd already learned the hard way about a storm brewing in there. But this time, the cloud wasn't just over them. It was over me. Around noon, Elena called me into her private office. The door slammed shut behind me with a click, as definitive as the handcuffs that would follow. She looked tired, but strangely gentle. She said she needed me to deliver an envelope to a specific house in a neighborhood I almost never went to. It wasn't uncommon for me to ask her to do small errands, so I didn't suspect anything. But there was something about the way she held the envelope, as if it had been too heavy to be just paper. "Don't open it, under any circumstances," she said, "and don't tell anyone. It'll be quick. Go, hand it over, sign for the collection if they ask, and come back." She handed me the address written on a folded piece of paper. I could have refused. I could have said it wasn't part of my job, that I didn't feel comfortable. But, at that time, I had already turned down so many opportunities that saying no would have sounded like betrayal. I took the envelope, the paper with the address, and left, trying to swallow the feeling that something was out of place. The house was tucked away on a quiet street, with expensive cars parked in high walls, the kind that hide more than they protect. When I rang the doorbell, I didn't hear footsteps. Instead, the half-open door creaked open, as if it had been left that way on purpose. I called twice. No answer. My adrenaline started to surge. Everything inside me told me to leave, drop the envelope in the mailbox, and disappear. But curiosity, mixed with the fear of failure, pushed me one step inside. The smell of iron came first. Then, the silence, heavy and unlike any living house. When my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw the outlines. Overturned furniture, a broken vase on the floor, dark stains I didn't want to identify. That's when I noticed the silhouettes on the living room floor. 2 people, standing still, cold. Panic gripped my fingers before it reached the rest of my body. The envelope fell from my hand. I wanted to retreat, run back to the street, pretending I'd never been there. But there wasn't time. Sirens cut through the air outside. Lights began flickering on the walls before I even understood what was happening. Someone had called the police. Someone who wasn't me. When the police officers entered, guns drawn, I stood frozen in the middle of the room, breathless. My hands still raised in a futile reflex. One of them told me not to move. Another pointed to the envelope that had fallen beside me. "We have the delivery person," someone said, as if I were part of a planned delivery. I was handcuffed right there, with the bodies still on the ground, without even the chance to say a complete sentence. I tried to explain that I was only delivering an envelope, that I didn't know anything, but every word I spoke sounded like a fight compared to the carefully staged scene. Because that's what it was, a scene. A bloody theater set up for a single purpose. And I was the character chosen for the role of the villain. At the police station, the questions weren't really questions. They were accusations with a question mark at the end. They knew my name, my address, my position at the office. They knew I worked for the Petrovs. They knew I had left alone at that time, that there was no one to confirm what Elena had asked me. It's curious how, suddenly, all the details they always ignored about my life became important. The proof appeared far too quickly. A police officer entered the room with a folder in his hands and threw photos on the table. In one of them, I appeared entering my house, seen by a security camera across the street. Furthermore, there were records of phone calls between the office number and the landline at that address, always at times that coincided with my presence at work. To top it all off, there were bank statements for transfers in the name of an account I had never seen, but which, according to them, was linked to my CPF, Brazilian taxpayer identification number. All of this seemed absurd to me, but for someone who had already decided my role in the story, it was too perfect to be casual. While I was being questioned, the pastor made his own pronouncement, only this time from the altar. Later, I would see excerpts on the evening news. He spoke about violence in the city, about how evil hides in seemingly innocent faces, about how even seemingly defenseless young people could be instruments of darkness. Without mentioning my name, he spoke to me, and the congregation applauded. That same night, we leaked details of the case to the press. Someone whispered that I had direct links to the Petrov family, that I was a trusted employee, and that I had privileged access to confidential information. None of these terms appeared in my contract, but they fit perfectly into the new story I wanted to tell. The headline was already written before any lawyer even came near me. When, exhausted, I asked to speak about who was really behind it all, they laughed. One of the detectives leaned across the table and said, "Are you saying that a respected religious leader who spends his time helping the community is behind a crime like this? Is that it?" I said yes. And in that exact second, I realized I had made the worst mistake of my life. It wasn't just that no one would believe him. The problem was that he couldn't be considered. The entire system was designed to scrutinize him. The pastor was the only untouchable in the room, even without being present. And I, handcuffed, was just the completely perfect piece. A mafia criminal, a girl who worked with the Petrovs, found next to the bodies, with an envelope that no one else seemed interested in examining the contents of. For them, the crime was solved. For me, it was just the beginning of the biggest lie I would be forced to swallow. The first thing prison takes from you isn't freedom. It's your name. As soon as I passed through the iron gate, I became a number, a record. a face in a corridor full of other tired faces. The cell where they put me seemed smaller than the bathroom in my house. The walls bore fingernail marks, scratches, phrases written with what looked like rust, but I knew it wasn't. The smell was a mixture of cheap disinfectant, mold, and something I didn't want to identify. The thin mattress, placed on a concrete frame, had holes, stains, and a history of its own, having endured many people breaking things on top of it. When the door closed behind me, the sound of metal echoed longer than it should have. It was as if the sound wanted to make sure I understood. Inside, I was in no control. It didn't take long for other inmates to find out why I was there. News travels faster in prisons than in newspaper offices. A woman with short hair and a hard look was the first to approach, resting her shoulder on the bill, assessing me from head to toe. "So it's you," she said, "a mafia assassin." The way she spoke didn't sound like an accusation, but like curiosity. I swallowed hard. "I didn't do any of that," I replied, my voice lower than I wanted. She laughed, but didn't seem to find it funny. "In here, everyone swears they're innocent. The difference is that in your case, there are people outside who need you to be guilty. That makes you interesting. It's dangerous." That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every noise in the hallway felt like an alert. Distant laughter, muffled arguments, officers' footsteps, clinking keys. The darkness of the cell was pierced by a pale patch of light coming from the hallway, as if the world were out there, but never truly touching me. I stared at the cracked ceiling, mentally replaying every detail of the day of the crime, as if remembering everything could, somehow, rewrite the ending. The following days were a mixture of routine and threat. Weak coffee in the morning, counting, sunbathing, queuing for food, back to the cell. But beneath this repetitive surface, there was a language of its own, an invisible trajectory, a map of dangers that I didn't yet know how to read. And that's what almost killed me. I soon realized that my label had value in that place. Some looked at me with respect, as if I had done something they wouldn't dare. Others looked at me with hatred, thinking I was some kind of informant or important piece of the mafia. The truth, that I was just a compromised pawn, didn't matter. What mattered were the stories circulating through the corridors. During one of my first sunbathing sessions, an older woman, with scars on half of her face, moved by silently. She didn't say her name. She just walked beside me, as if we were just taking a stroll. "I heard it was the mafia you brought here," she murmured. "Actually, you have two problems." "Two?" "The mafia and the police who work for whoever set all this up. If you talk too much, neither side will want you to keep breathing. Look around." It seemed like everyone could hear everything and pretended not to hear anything. "So, what do I do then?" he asks. She shrugged. "Learn to stay alive long enough to make your own decisions. And that starts with trusting no one." The threat subtly changed. A torn note left on my mattress. "The mafia doesn't like traitors." A glass of water that appeared in my corner with a strange taste, which I threw away without a second thought. One night I woke up with the feeling of someone standing at my cell door, watching me in the dark. When I got up, I only saw the shadow silently disappearing down the hallway. But it wasn't just common crimes I wanted to silence. I realized this the day I was called in to speak with a representative of the church. A man in a neutral suit, his voice too soft for that environment, entered a cold room where he left me waiting. He placed a Bible on the table, as if it were an official document. "The community is praying for you," he said. "Our pastor always talks about forgiveness. If you acknowledge what you've done and truly seek God, he can transform this story." The cynicism of that almost made me laugh. "I have nothing to admit," I replied, "but I have a lot to tell. About the pastor, for example." The gleam in his eyes changed. Small, quick, but I saw it. "Be careful what you insinuate, daughter," he said, crossing his hands. "The wrong words can make your situation much worse. For you, and for those who are still out there." That conversation wasn't about spiritual comfort. It was a message, a polite warning that I should keep my mouth shut. As he left the room, he let slip, almost in a whisper, "Accept your cross. Some battles weren't meant to be won by people like you. From Dali, I understood that my enemy wasn't just a man hiding behind a pulpit. It was the entire web he had woven. People from the church, people in the streets, people in different uniforms. And I, locked in that place, was the weakest link in the chain. Even so, prison gave me something I didn't expect. Eyes. People no one listened to started talking to me. A tired prison guard who knew about strange actions coming in the name of the pastor's church. A female inmate who swore she saw one of the church's security guards in nighttime meetings with armed men in an abandoned warehouse. A former employee of the congregation itself, imprisoned for breaking his word, who said he had been sacrificed to protect someone more important. Each sentence, each boat, each loose piece of information became a piece of a puzzle. I still didn't know how to put it all together, but for the first time, I understood that I wasn't completely without weapons. The evidence wasn't just out there. Part of the truth also breathed and rotted inside, in those cells. And it was in that environment where nobody trusted anybody, where death always seemed to lurk behind the next iron door, that I made the decision to change everything. If they wanted me to be the perfect scapegoat, I would use exactly that against them. I was going to leave there, even if only with one thing in my hands. The proof that would show the world who really ran that hell disguised as a church. When you're arrested for a crime you didn't commit, you expect, at the very least, that someone will want to hear your side of the story. But the truth is, by the time I left the police station and went to prison, my story had already been told by other people, and nobody was interested in revising the script. The first time I saw it on TV was through an old set, taped to its stand in the room where the inmates waited for medical attention. A reporter spoke with the theatrical urgency they usually use in tragedies. New information about the double murder linked to the mafia. And then, my photo. A portrait taken years before, without makeup, without defense, frozen there, as if that were the only version of me that mattered. Trusted employee of the Petrov family is caught red-handed at the crime scene, the caption read. At no point did the reporter use words like suspect or under investigation. For the media, I was already guilty. For the audience, the story was too perfect to waste time on details. While showing images of the facade of the house where the crime took place, a voiceover explained how I had facilitated operations for the mafia for years and mediated messages between the criminal family and other groups. Nothing of it was in any legal proceedings. But it was in the imagination of the person whose attention I wanted to sell a few more seconds of. The other inmates watched silently, some with pity, others with that distant look of someone who has seen this happen many times before. When the segment ended, one of them, sitting next to me, took a deep breath and said, "The worst sentence isn't the judge's, it's the TV's." She was right. In a few minutes, I went from being a person to a character. The mafia assistant, the deceived girl with a fragile appearance, a package ready for quick consumption between a laundry detergent commercial and a car ad. But nothing hurt as much as the next part of the story. They cut to a segment of a church service. The pastor, before hundreds of worshippers, spoke about the danger of wolves in sheep's clothing and people who feign innocence while working alongside darkness. He spoke of me without saying my name. He spoke with the authority of someone who knew that, in that war between narrative and truth, he had already won before the first round. Social media did the rest. I don't need to see to know. Comments like stones thrown from afar. She deserves to rot in jail. If you worked with the mafia, you're just as rotten as they are. May God have mercy on her soul, because human justice must be severe. People who had never seen my face outside of a screen were already absolutely certain about who I was. My mother's family, who rarely contacted us about important matters, found time to appear on late afternoon television programs, talking about my strange behavior in recent months, about the mysterious new job of which I never shared details. None of them knew enough to defend me, but they knew enough to turn doubts into small public betrayals. Letters did arrive, but not as I had expected. Instead of support, there were anonymous threats, reported in newspapers with phrases like, "The mafia collects its due," and Whoever messes with big shots pays the price. The account was clear. Any attempt on my part to tell a different version from the official one would be treated as a danger, and dangers are eliminated. Even the church entered the fray in an institutional way. In a statement read at the end of a service, one of the assistants said that the congregation deeply regretted the crimes linked to the Petrov family and asked for prayers for the young woman involved in the events, that she might repent and find the true light. There was no suggestion of doubt nor of investigation, just the subtle verdict of those who bless the public and condemn the individual with the same phrase. Inside prison, all of this had a silent and cruel effect. The few people who still hesitated to judge me began to keep their distance. After all, who would be crazy enough to get too close to the mafia assassin, who was now also the enemy of a man adored by half the city? Loneliness became the uniform. Visits dwindled before they even began. Childhood friends didn't show up. Work colleagues pretended never to have known me. The only person who still tried to get close was my mother. But even she was now barred by health problems, financial limitations, and above all, fear. Not of the prison itself, but of what she wanted to be seen with someone everyone had already decided was guilty. The system knows how to break a person, not just by locking up their body, but by tearing away every tie that could remind them that they are still human. And so it was, surrounded by a majority that had already judged me without listening to me, that I understood the magnitude of the battle. Proving my innocence with a piece of paper, an audio recording, or a video wouldn't be enough. I would be fighting against something much bigger, a story carefully constructed by someone who controlled both people's fear and faith. But it was precisely in this realization that the seed of my counterattack was born. If a city only believed those who spoke from a pulpit, I would need to find something so irrefutable, so brutal, that not even the pastor could clothe it in verses. Public opinion would not be my ally, but, with the right proof in hand, it could become the weapon he never imagined would turn against him. And it was this piece of evidence, small, seemingly insignificant, but devastating, that I was beginning to try and find inside. From the moment I understood that proclaiming my innocence would help somewhat, I decided to stop fighting to convince and started searching for evidence. And it was prison, ironic as only life can be, that gave me access to secrets that no one on the outside would dare to share. In the beginning, all I had were rumors. Stories told during sunbathing sessions, whispers about prison guards facilitating transfers for certain prisoners of interest to the church or the mafia, murmurs about nighttime visits from influential people who were never searched like the others. I began to listen to every conversation, memorize every name and unusual situation, mentally noting any detail that deviated from the norm. Then, a female inmate told me that she had worked for one of the NGOs supported by the pastor. She went on to say, almost whispering, that some of the money raised never reached its intended recipients, and that they used people like her to launder small amounts, multiplying deposits in the names of humble believers who could barely read. This matched details I myself had seen when I worked in the Petrov's office. Transfers that were donations in advance, but which would always return days later to accounts of event companies or suppliers linked to the church. A former employee, arrested for advanced theft, but known in the ward as an accountant, confirmed the money trail. Shell companies, duplicate invoices, cross-payments between the mafia's slush funds and blessed companies as part of a money laundering scheme distributed across several states. All hidden behind cross-invoices, typical of real investigations. This gave me the courage to ask my mother, during one of the supervised obligations, to look for old bank statements, copies of contracts, or any receipt with the name of an unknown company, even if it didn't make sense at the time. My letters became coded. Each innocent sentence hid a clue. Data, names of suppliers or church volunteers who, in reality, acted as intermediaries for larger shipments. "Is so-and-so's basic food basket late?" was my way of asking about the last transfer to the suspicious NGO. One of the guards, aware of the indirect threats from the church, started leaving coded notes in my locker. "Review the blue receipt." She wanted to search, in my mother's collection of old papers, for documents that directly linked the church to one of the companies used by Petrov to launder money. Still, I need irrefutable evidence. A recording, an audio file, something impossible to deny or manipulate. I started paying attention to all the technical visits inside the prison. One of them included a religious volunteer, qualified to pray for the inmates, but with him came a recording device hidden in an eyeglass case, which a friend who was an inmate had obtained through a contact in the kitchen. When the pastor made a direct call, discussing details of the forgiveness to be negotiated for certain families, he managed to record parts of the conversation in which he spoke, in code, about cleansing the spirit and making the problems disappear from the bank statements. It was the proof that combined the money and the voice. The stitching together of all the boats, accounts from inside and outside, documents recovered by my mother, and audio recordings made there became a clear mosaic. With the help of a lawyer recommended by one of the detainees, I sent a copy of this evidence to an international human rights NGO. I needed someone outside the reach of the mafia and, above all, outside the pastor's circle of influence. There, for the first time in months, I felt I had a real chance to confront everything that was crushing me. It remained to be seen if the world outside would have the courage to hear what the brutal truth carried, that faith, money, and crime were intertwined in a system where those who should be protecting the most were the ones who profited most from the misfortune of others. My role as the villain ready to be sacrificed was nearing its end. And with each new piece of this puzzle, the shepherd's mask began to crumble before the city's very eyes. When the first responses from the human rights NGO arrived, I wasn't expecting any miracles. But, unlike the lawyers who treated me as a lost cause, they took every detail seriously. They cross-referenced information, checked companies linked to the church, and searched public records of donations and transfers. And little by little, what for many was merely suspicious began to take shape in documents. The most important evidence wasn't the audio alone, nor the isolated bank statements. It was the combination of everything. The date of the pastor's call, talking about solving the girl's problem related to the family, hours after the crime. The transfer of funds to a shell company used by the Petrovs, and the use of the same company in spiritual consulting contracts with the church. The system he lost had one flaw: too much confidence in his own impunity. The NGO filed a formal petition requesting the reopening of the investigation, attaching the evidence. It wasn't due to the goodwill of the local police that the case was brought back to the table. It was out of shame. An international institution, with important people watching, was demanding explanations. Some prominent figures no longer wanted to be associated with a possible scandal of faith and crime. It was less a matter of justice, more a matter of trust. But for me, that was enough. The day the pastor was summoned to testify, the city trembled. Not from an earthquake, but from shock. He appeared in a dark suit, Bible in hand, surrounded by lawyers and sincere witnesses who wept, saying he was a victim of persecution. He smiled for the cameras with rehearsed humility, but his eyes betrayed something else: anger. For the first time, someone dragged him into the same harsh light he had used to expose so many others. My trial was reopened. Sitting in the defendant's dock once more, I felt the weight of the invisible shackles still there, but something was different. It was no longer just my word against his. It was my story tied to facts that couldn't be untied with a sermon. The prosecutor, this time pressured by new evidence, was forced to admit that there were inconsistencies in the initial investigation. The connections between the church, the shell companies, and Petrov's business dealings were projected on a screen before everyone. When the audio was played, the pastor's voice talking about closing the wound before it bleeds to the public, indirectly, but too clearly to be a coincidence, alluding to my situation, the silence in the courtroom was unlike any other I had ever known. It wasn't a silence of indifference. It was the silence of someone watching their idol crack. His lawyers planned everything. They said the audio was edited, that the calls were merely administrative dealings, that any connection between the church and the mafia was the result of external infiltration. But the more they talked, the more the puzzle revealed a picture that could not be undone. The witnesses who were previously afraid to speak. A former church collaborator received strange payments and orders to destroy documents. A retired police officer revealed he received guidance not to investigate certain companies linked to the pastor. The inmate who worked at the NGO appeared in a recorded video detailing the payments, protected by a witness protection program. In that courtroom, the man who preached every Sunday finally had to answer the questions he couldn't deflect with verses. He tried to use faith as a shield once more, saying that all of that was an attack from the enemy. But this time, the enemy had data, value, account numbers, and expert-authenticated recordings. When the judge reviewed my predictions, the words that came from afar were announced. He acknowledged that the investigation had been conducted in a biased manner, that the evidence against me was tainted, and that there were strong promises of framing by interested third parties, among them, the pastor. I didn't hear the word apology from the mouth of any authority. The system doesn't apologize. It just tries to move on. But I heard the word I had been waiting for years. Acquitted. As I left the courthouse, there were no crowds waiting for me with flowers, nor collective apologies. There were cameras, of course, capturing my actions as if I were just another spectacle. Some people lowered their heads as I passed. Others still looked at me with suspicion. For many, I would remain a lucky mafia assassin. But for the first time, the lie was no longer the official version. The pastor, in turn, left in handcuffs through the back door weeks later, when new accusations were added to mine. Financial crimes, association with a criminal organization, witness intimidation. None of that brought back the years I lost. But seeing his image, without a microphone, without an altar, without an impeccable suit, was the first real crack in the wall he had so carefully erected. The city would take a long time to digest it. Many preferred to say that he was swallowed by the system, that he had made mistakes, but also done a lot of good, trying to soften the horror of everything that came to light. For others, he was never really a suspect, just persecuted, because in the end, accepting that the man in whom you placed your faith was the same one who signed alliances with crime is more painful than admitting that you were deceived. I knew my life would never be the same again. But I also knew that, with the right story told, I could do something about it. I could at least prevent another girl from going through the same machine that almost killed me. And that's why you're hearing all this now. Because my freedom didn't come in the form of forgetfulness. It came in the form of commitment, to tell, in detail, how a mafia boss dressed as a pastor built an empire of lies, and how the truth, a single well-proven truth, was enough to begin to tear it all down. When the doors finally opened and I left prison without handcuffs, I realized that freedom made no noise. There were no fireworks, no applause, no signs saying, "You won." There was only a world just like the one I left outside, but in which I was no longer the same person who entered. The city streets are smaller, and the temples larger. People passed by me as if I were invisible, or as if they were afraid to look for too long. I quickly discovered that being innocent in court doesn't clear your name in people's minds. To some, I remained the mafia girl. To others, I had become the enemy of the faith, the one who dared to point the finger at a man they called anointed. Many preferred the comfort of lies rather than face the discomfort of truth, but still, his downfall left its mark on the city walls. Plaques were removed, TV programs changed their focus, old allies disappeared from photos next to him as if they had never been there. I could have tried to forget everything. Get a job far away, change my name, pretend it was just difficult years. But every time I thought about moving on as if nothing had happened, I remembered the sound of the cell door closing, the look in the eyes of the women who never had the right to a decent lawyer, the silence of the victims who never had anyone to fight for them. The justice that came to me didn't erase how blind the system remains to those who have no proof, no voice, or anyone willing to listen. That's when I decided to do the one thing he never imagined I would do: tell this story from beginning to end. No altar, no special lighting, no promises of miracles. To tell exactly how faith can be used as the perfect mask for evil, how the appearance of holiness can reveal alliances with crime, and how an ordinary person, with far less power than all the other players, can still pull the only trigger these people truly possess, the trigger of truth. Because, in the end, it's not just about me, about him, or about the mafia. It's about all the times someone was silenced because the suspect seemed too good to be questioned. About all the stories buried beneath beautiful speeches. And about the choice each person makes when they discover something uncomfortable. To pretend they didn't see it. Or to let it change the way they see the world. If this story affects you in any way, do something simple but powerful. Comment below if you've ever seen someone above suspicion fall from their pedestal. Share this video with anyone who still believes that appearance is truly symbolic. Leave a like so this story reaches more people who need to hear it. And if you'd like to journey with me through the upcoming revelations, subscribe to the channel. Perhaps we can't change the whole world, but every truth spoken aloud is a piece of a silent lie that ceases to rule.